Hello there and welcome to Sleepy Science. Long before numbers had names, people noticed something that made them uneasy. It was not a clear thought. It was a feeling, a quiet pressure in the mind, the sense that something was repeating when it should not have been. The world looked alive, yet parts of it behaved as if they were following a hidden habit. They saw it in the way leaves spread on a stem, not lined up, not random, spaced apart in a way that felt careful, too careful to be chance. They saw it in pine cones, where rows crossed each other without touching. They saw it in shells pulled from the sea, each curve growing wider but never breaking its shape. No one explained it. No one could. The pattern did not ask to be understood. It simply appeared. This was not curiosity yet. It was discomfort. The kind that stays when you cannot explain why something feels ordered. People trusted chaos. Storms made sense. Fire made sense. Death made sense, but this did not. This quiet repetition did not announce itself. It hid inside growth, inside life, and it returned again and again. There was no counting involved. No one stood there adding numbers. No one measured angles or lengths. They only noticed spacing, gaps that felt chosen, as if something invisible was deciding where the next leaf should not grow, as if absence mattered as much as presence. That idea alone was unsettling. A hunter might stop while walking through tall plants. He would notice how the leaves avoided blocking each other. Light reached deeper than expected. Nothing seemed wasted. It was as if the plant knew how much space it needed before it even grew. But plants did not think. Everyone knew that. Still, the spacing remained. A child playing with shells might stack them in a line, the smallest first, then larger ones. The curve stayed smooth. It never jumped, never bent the wrong way. The child did not know why this mattered, only that breaking the order felt wrong, like interrupting a sentence before it finished. These moments did not turn into stories. They turned into silence. People did not talk about them because there were no words that fit. Language was built for action, for warning, for trade. This pattern did none of those things. It did not help hunt. It did not help survive directly, yet it stayed visible. Over time, people learned to ignore it. The mind is good at that. When something does not offer danger or reward, it fades into the background. But it never vanished. It waited in plants, in bones. In the way living things chose where to grow next, it was patient. Some felt it more than others. They sensed that growth was not free, that it followed a path, not a rule, a preference. But even that word did not exist yet. So the feeling stayed raw, unnamed, heavy. At night, sitting near fire, people watched flames rise. Fire had no pattern like this. It moved wildly. It consumed and vanished. The contrast was sharp. Living things grew differently, slowly, carefully, as if each step depended on the last, as if memory existed without a mind. This raised a quiet fear. If growth followed something unseen, then life was not fully wild. And if it was not wild, then it was not fully free. That thought was dangerous, so it stayed unspoken. Patterns often suggest intention. Intention suggests a planner, but no planner could be seen. No hand shaped the leaves. No force pushed the shells into curve. The world felt guided without a guide. That was the problem. People were used to gods that acted loudly. Thunder, floods, fire from the sky. This pattern did none of that. It whispered. It worked in silence. It did not demand belief. It did not punish doubt. It simply continued. Someone carving wood might notice how branches split. One became two. Two became more. Not evenly. One branch stronger, one weaker. But together they balanced. The shape felt stable. Removing one ruined the form. This was not symmetry, it was something else. Symmetry was easy. Symmetry pleased the eye. This did not. It pleased something deeper, something harder to explain. It felt correct without being neat. That made it harder to dismiss. Time passed, generations passed, the feeling survived without explanation, like a question passed down without words. Each new pair of eyes saw the same spacing, the same curves, the same quiet order hiding inside growth. Some people tried to copy it in art. They failed. Their designs felt stiff, too perfect. The living pattern resisted being frozen. It needed growth. It needed change. Without that, it lost its meaning. Others assumed it was coincidence. The mind looks for order where none exists. That was easier to accept. Yet coincidence usually breaks. This did not. It repeated across places that never touched, across plants that never met. The unease grew stronger when people realized it was not limited to beauty. Bones followed it too, joints spaced in a way that carried weight without strain, teeth arranged to fit without waste. Even the body seemed to know where to place the next part. Still, no one named it. Naming gives control, and this thing resisted control. It was safer to let it remain a feeling, a background presence, something noticed then forgotten. But forgetting never erased it. It waited for attention, not loudly, patiently, like a sentence paused mid-thought, like a story that had started long before anyone learned how to tell it. This was the beginning, not of understanding, but of tension, between what was seen and what could be said, between instinct and explanation. And that tension did not go away. It prepared the ground for something else, something more deliberate, something that would try to force growth into lines and numbers. And when that happened, the unease would return, stronger than before. As time moved forward, people stopped only watching. They began to interfere. Unease was no longer enough. They wanted answers. More than that, they wanted control. The first tool they reached for was counting. Counting felt solid. It felt reliable. If something could be counted, it could be managed. They started with simple marks. One line for one thing, two lines for two things. Stones were placed in rows. Sticks were stacked side by side. This worked well for animals. It worked for days past and food stored. It worked for trade. So they assumed it would work for growth as well. They tried to apply the same logic to plants. They planted seeds in straight rows, equal gaps, equal distance. The ground looked neat, orderly. It pleased the eye. It felt right, at least at first. But the plants did not agree. Some grew taller than others. Some leaned away. Leaves twisted, blocking their neighbors or reaching into open space that was never planned. The straight lines broke slowly, but they always broke. No matter how carefully the spacing was measured, the result was uneven. People adjusted. They measured again. They reduced gaps, then widened them. They followed the numbers exactly. Still, the plants behaved as if the lines were suggestions, not rules. Growth ignored the grid. This was frustrating. Numbers were supposed to work. Numbers did not argue. They did not bend. Yet here in the soil, something pushed back. Not violently, quietly, persistently. Farmers noticed that crowded plants fought for light, but spreading them evenly did not solve the problem either. Some leaves still shadowed others. Some spaces stayed empty. It felt like the plant knew where not to grow, but humans did not. The idea that growth could resist control was unsettling. Humans had learned to shape stone, to guide water, to tame animals. But growth itself seemed to slip through their hands. It followed its own logic, one that counting could not fully describe. They tried patterns instead of rows, circles, grids within grids. The ground became a drawing. But life did not care about drawings. Roots spread where water waited. Leaves turned toward light without asking permission. The planned shape slowly dissolved. This resistance was not dramatic. No sudden failure. Crops still grew. But they never matched expectation. Something was always off. A leaf too close. A stem too far. A space that stayed empty for no clear reason. The frustration deepened when people noticed that wild plants often grew better. They were not placed carefully. No one measured their distance. Yet they thrived. They used space efficiently. They shared light in ways planted fields did not. This raised an uncomfortable question. What if control was the problem? What if counting forced growth into forms it was never meant to follow? That thought was hard to accept. Counting had brought progress. Letting go felt like stepping backward. So people doubled down. They refined their systems. They invented better ways to measure distance. They marked land with strings and stakes. The lines became sharper, the rules clearer. Still, growth refused to behave. The more precise the system became, the clearer its limits appeared. Numbers described position, but not choice. They showed where something was placed, not where it wanted to be. Growth seemed to make decisions moment by moment based on what already existed. This was especially clear in branching plants. One stem split into two, but not evenly. One side always took more space. The next split adjusted again. No two branches followed the same plan. Counting could track them, but it could not predict them. People began to sense that growth responded to itself. Each new part depended on the last. Straight lines assumed independence. Growth did not. It remembered where it had been, even without memory. This idea caused tension. If growth followed itself, then forcing it into fixed patterns would always create conflict. The numbers were not wrong. They were just incomplete. Still, no better tool existed, so people continued. They built gardens that looked perfect from above and struggled from within. They planted orchards that demanded constant correction. Every season became a fight against imbalance. The frustration was not loud. It did not lead to anger. It led to persistence. Humans believed that if they refined the system enough, growth would eventually comply. It never did. Slowly, attention shifted, not to numbers alone, but to what happened between numbers, the spaces, the gaps, the choices growth made when left alone. People began to watch again, but now with purpose. They noticed that wild plants rarely crossed each other. Leaves avoided overlap. Stems curved away from crowding without instruction. Growth seemed aware of space in a way numbers were not. This did not solve the problem yet. It only sharpened it. Control had reached its limit. Counting had failed to trap growth. The resistance was clear now. Quiet, consistent, unyielding. And in that frustration, something important happened. People stopped assuming that growth needed to be forced into order. They began to suspect that order was already there, not straight, not counted, but present. That suspicion did not bring relief. It brought more questions, and questions once formed do not fade easily. When people stopped forcing growth into straight lines, they began to notice something else. Growth was not trying to look good. It was trying to work. The shapes that once felt decorative now looked practical. The curves were not there to please the eye. They were there to solve a problem. The problem was always space. Space was limited. Light was limited. Water was limited. Every living thing had to compete without fighting. Growth had to find room without pushing others away too hard. That was the quiet challenge. Leaves did not spread evenly because they wanted balance. They spread unevenly to avoid blocking each other. Each new leaf appeared where light was still available, not where it looked nice, not where it felt fair, where it could survive. This was easiest to see in crowded places, on forest floors, on rocky slopes, on trees growing close together. Where space was tight, growth became clever. Leaves twisted, stems bent. Patterns appeared more clearly there, not less. People realized that when space was open, growth was messy, random-looking, free, but when space was tight, order emerged. That order was not planned. It was shaped by limits. A plant growing alone did not care much about spacing. It could waste space and still live. But when surrounded, waste became dangerous. Overlap meant shadow, shadow meant loss, loss meant death. Efficiency was not optional. This changed how people saw beauty. Beauty was no longer a goal, it was evidence. Evidence that something had solved a problem well. A shell that curved smoothly was not beautiful because of its shape. It was beautiful because it grew without breaking, without wasting material, without stopping. The same was true for flowers. Petals arranged in ways that avoided covering each other. Seeds placed so none crushed the rest. The pattern appeared strongest where mistakes were costly. This idea felt uncomfortable at first. Beauty had always been linked to intention, to choice, to desire. But here beauty came from pressure, from survival, from necessity. People noticed that when conditions changed, the pattern softened, in rich soil, with plenty of light, with little competition. Growth relaxed. It became less strict, less ordered. The pattern faded. That alone said something important. If the pattern were decoration, it would appear everywhere. If it were a rule, it would never break. But it appeared only when needed. That made it something else. Efficiency explained what counting could not. Numbers place things evenly. Efficiency placed things effectively. One ignored context. The other depended on it. This helped explain why forced planting failed. Even spacing looked fair but ignored reality. Some spots had more light. Some had better soil. Growth responded to those differences instantly. No plan could match that speed. People began to see that growth did not follow beauty. Beauty followed growth. The order came later in the mind of the observer. The plant did not care how it looked. It cared how it lived. This shift was subtle but powerful. It removed humans from the center. The pattern was not for them. It was not trying to impress. It existed long before eyes were there to see it. The idea spread quietly. Artists felt it. Farmers sensed it. Builders began to consider it. Efficiency was not cold. It was precise. It allowed survival without excess. People started watching how growth handled limits, how it avoided overlap, how it reused space instead of claiming more. Each new part adjusted to what already existed. This adjustment created flow, not smoothness, not symmetry, flow, a feeling that nothing was forced, that nothing was wasted. The more people looked, the clearer it became. The pattern did not appear because nature liked it. It appeared because alternatives failed. Straight lines broke under pressure. Random spacing collapsed under crowding. Only certain arrangements endured. That endurance looked beautiful to the human eye, but beauty was a side effect, a reward for efficiency, not the reason for it. This realization changed how people thought about design. Trying to copy the shape without understanding the pressure behind it felt empty. It produced hollow results. The shape alone meant nothing. Without limits, the pattern lost meaning. Without competition, it disappeared. That made it fragile and powerful. People began to respect it not as a symbol but as a response. A response to scarcity, to time, to space. Growth did not chase perfection. It avoided failure. That was enough. This way of thinking did not bring comfort. It brought clarity. The world was not arranged to be admired. It was arranged to continue. And somewhere inside that continuation, the same spacing kept appearing. Not because it was special, but because it worked. That thought stayed with them, quiet, persistent, preparing the mind for something harder to accept. Because if growth chose efficiency over beauty, then perfection was never the goal. And if perfection was not the goal, then exactness would never arrive. Once people accepted that beauty came from survival, another idea followed slowly. The pattern was not clean. It was never exact. The more closely they looked, the more uneven it became. Curves bent slightly off course. Spacing shifted. Counts changed. Nothing lined up perfectly. At first, this looked like failure. Humans were trained to trust precision. straight lines, equal gaps, clean repetition. When something was uneven, it was assumed to be wrong, a mistake, a flaw to be corrected. But the living world refused correction. Every attempt to fix it made things worse. Straightening a stem weakened it. Forcing symmetry caused crowding. Removing irregular parts often slowed growth instead of improving it. This raised a difficult question. What if imperfection was not error? What if it was part of the process? Leaves told this story clearly. No two were placed at the same angle. No two followed the same path outward. If someone tried to measure the gaps, the numbers never matched perfectly. Yet the result worked. Light reached deeper. Air moved freely. The plant stayed balanced. The pattern was not broken. It was flexible. It adjusted to small changes without collapsing. Precision would have made it fragile. Exact spacing would fail the moment conditions shifted. People noticed this in shells as well. The curve was smooth but never identical from start to end. Growth responded to damage, to pressure, to changes in the environment. The shape bent to survive, not to remain pure. This was hard to accept. Human systems relied on exactness. Buildings collapsed when measurements were off. Tools failed when shapes were wrong. Precision meant safety, but life played by different rules. Living systems faced constant change. Wind, light, damage, competition. If they followed strict rules, they would break often. Instead, they allowed variation. Small errors that were not errors at all. The pattern appeared more like a range than a rule, a direction, not a command. Growth leaned toward it when possible and away from it when necessary. That leaning was enough. People slowly stopped expecting perfection. They learned to look for tendency instead, where things usually moved, how often certain spacing appeared. Not exact numbers, but repeated behavior. This changed how they measured success. A plant did not need perfect spacing to thrive. It needed spacing that worked most of the time. The rest could be adjusted on the way. This idea clashed with earlier beliefs. Rules were supposed to be followed. Laws were supposed to hold. Here was something that only worked when it was allowed to bend. The more people observed, the clearer it became. The pattern was strongest when conditions were stable and weakest when conditions shifted. Yet even then, it did not disappear. It adapted. Branches showed this well. One side would grow stronger if the other was damaged. The spacing adjusted. The overall form remained balanced, though no plan had predicted it. This balance without exactness felt unsettling. It meant control was limited. That life could not be fully planned. That systems had to allow room for change. People began to see precision as a human need, not a natural one. Nature needed resilience more than accuracy. Survival rewarded those who could adjust, not those who followed rules perfectly. The pattern became a guide, not a target, something growth aimed toward but never locked into. This explained why attempts to copy it often failed. The copies were too exact, too rigid. A perfect curve drawn on paper meant nothing without growth behind it, without adjustment, without response to pressure. It was empty. This realization stripped away another illusion, that nature was clean, that it followed hidden formulas with perfect obedience. Instead, it worked with rough edges and small deviations. People stopped asking why the pattern was not exact. They started asking how it remained stable despite change. That question felt more honest. Approximation replaced precision. Close enough became powerful. Flexible spacing outperformed perfect alignment. Slight imbalance allowed correction. This idea reached beyond plants. Bones healed unevenly. Scars formed. Bodies adapted. Life favored what worked, not what matched a plan. The pattern survived because it allowed error, or rather because what looked like error was actually choice. A response to conditions that could not be predicted in advance. This made the pattern harder to define, harder to explain, but also harder to dismiss. It was not a formula that could be broken. It was a behavior that adjusted. People who still searched for exactness felt disappointed. Those who accepted variation felt closer to understanding. The expectation of clean rules slowly faded. In its place grew respect for systems that could bend without breaking, systems that survived change instead of resisting it. The pattern did not promise perfection. It offered endurance. And once that was understood, attention shifted again, away from shape, away from spacing, toward something deeper, toward the order in which things happened. The pattern people had been noticing was not just about space. Slowly, they began to see it in time. It was not the leaf that mattered or the curve of a shell. It was the order in which each part appeared. One decision followed another. Branch after branch, petal after petal. Growth unfolded like a story written without words. A stem would rise and the next would split off at a certain point, not by chance, not by a ruler, by the result of the first decision, and the next, and the next. Each step depended on what came before. The sequence shaped the outcome more than the spacing ever could. People realized that if they only looked at the final shape, they missed the secret. The pattern was hidden in the steps, in the timing, in how one element allowed the next to exist. It was a map of process, not a picture. Consider a flower. The first petals appear, small and tight. The next petals grow around them, finding gaps, adjusting angles. Each one waits for the last to occupy space before deciding where to appear. The full bloom only makes sense when seen as a chain of decisions. Even shells followed the same idea. The spiral did not exist all at once. Each turn came after the last. Each curve added to the form already there. If one step had been different, the whole shape would have changed. It was not the line that mattered. It was the order in which it formed. This made the pattern feel alive in a new way. It was not just structure. It was movement through time. Each new part was like a small experiment. Adjustments happened as growth responded to the environment. Some failed, some succeeded, and the successful ones became the next step. People noticed this in trees too. A branch grew upward, and the next branch spread to fill the empty space. The next split off in response. The tree was like a conversation with itself, each decision aware only of what had already happened, not what would come. Time revealed another feature. The pattern could recover from mistakes. If a branch broke, the next one adjusted. If a leaf was eaten, the stem grew differently. The sequence could bend, pause, or skip steps, but it still carried the same underlying rhythm. This rhythm was invisible when looking at a single moment. Only when observing over time did it appear. A slow observer could trace it, seeing how the choices built upon each other. Each step depended on context, on what had already grown. That was the secret that counting and spacing alone could never capture. Even in crowded forests, this order showed itself. Plants competing for light would twist and bend in sequence, avoiding overlap with neighbors. The first leaves created gaps. The next leaves filled them. The following leaves adjusted to both the first and second. A complex dance emerged, not in a single moment but across time. People began to sense that time itself was a part of growth, not clock time, not the passage of days, something else. The sequence of choices that life took as it expanded. This made the pattern dynamic, alive, capable of adapting, unstoppable. The idea challenged everything humans thought they knew. Control, exactness, and shape were no longer enough. To understand the pattern, they had to watch it unfold. They had to follow the story step by step. And the story was never the same twice. Even in shells, tiny deviations accumulated over time. Each rotation depended on the last. A slight difference in early growth affected later turns. The sequence was cumulative. A mistake in timing could bend the spiral, yet the general form remained. It was resilient but never rigid. This understanding revealed another truth. Life did not plan its final form. It only responded to the moment, building each new step on the last. The shape emerged, but only as a result of time passing. Order was a product of sequence, not intention. Humans tried to impose sequence on growth. They planted rows in order, hoping that counting steps would create control. It failed because they ignored the responsiveness of each moment. Growth adjusted to what existed, not to what was planned. Sequence depended on conditions, not human rules. The realization was subtle, but it changed perspective. Sequence was the hidden dimension. Space showed where parts appeared. Time showed when and why they appeared. Without sequence, the pattern could not exist. Without sequence, the mystery remained invisible. People began to notice how small changes at one step affected everything that followed. A bent stem could alter the curve of a flower. A crowded seed could change the spiral of a pinecone. Sequence mattered more than exact numbers, more than alignment, more than symmetry. This insight revealed the elegance behind imperfection. What looked uneven was often the result of careful sequencing. Growth adjusted to conditions, responded to obstacles, and followed paths that space alone could not dictate. Imperfections became evidence of timing, evidence that each decision had a reason, even if it was invisible. Observing over time, humans saw a quiet intelligence. Not thinking intelligence, but logic born of necessity. Step by step, growth chose paths that allowed survival. The order built itself without intervention. It was as if the pattern existed because time allowed it, not because anyone commanded it. Even in chaos, sequence held some control. Wind bent stems, animals nibbled leaves, rain flooded soil. Growth adjusted in response. Each step depended on what had survived the previous step. The rhythm continued, reshaping itself without losing the underlying structure. This made people realize something else. Sequence was invisible to the casual observer. It required patience to notice. It required following each step, understanding how one decision led to the next. Only then did the hidden order appear. And when they saw it, it was like watching a quiet pulse, a heartbeat within nature, not measured by time, not predictable, but undeniably present. Each decision led to the next. Branches, leaves, petals, shells, all following the same rhythm. Not exact, not rigid, but persistent. The idea was both simple and impossible to hold. Simple because it only asked for attention. Impossible because attention alone could not control it. Sequence was not something humans could impose. It could only be observed, traced, and respected. By the end of this understanding, people began to change how they thought about growth. It was not just about where something appeared, not just about how it looked. It was about the order of events, the timing of decisions, the unseen logic moving step by step. And in that realization, a new curiosity arose. If sequence was the hidden dimension, what else might be hidden in time? What other patterns were waiting to be noticed, only if someone could follow them carefully? Growth had become more than shape. It had become story. A story without words, unfolding quietly. And those who watched closely could see it, could feel it, could wonder at it. The sequence was everywhere, waiting in the steps, not the places, and the story was far from over. Humans finally stepped closer to understanding what had always been there, but they could not grasp it fully. The pattern was visible, but it was alive, changing, bending with time. What they could see, they could not control. What they could control, they could not see. And yet, they wanted a handle on it. They wanted it in a form they could hold, write, and pass on. Mathematics entered quietly, not as a discovery of something new, but as a tool to simplify what already existed. Humans saw repetition. They saw spacing, spirals, sequences. They gave it names, numbers, symbols, letters. They created a language to hold something that could not be held. The living process resisted this. Growth was messy, irregular, responsive, adaptive, yet mathematics flattened it. Curves became formulas. Twisting stems became equations. Spirals became numbers. The richness of life compressed into symbols that never needed to bend, adjust, or respond. People felt satisfaction in this. Finally, the pattern had a label. Finally, it could be shared, taught, copied. And yet, satisfaction was partial. Something had been lost. The pattern lived because it changed. The symbols lived because they did not. The compression made understanding easier, but deeper understanding harder. Symbols suggested certainty. Numbers suggested rules. People assumed control followed. But the living pattern was not under control. It continued quietly, indifferent to the names and formulas. Historians and mathematicians traced spirals in shells, leaf arrangements, and flower petals. They described them. They counted. They calculated ratios. The sequence became famous. Humans claimed knowledge. Yet the claim was only partially true. The process had existed for eons before anyone wrote it down. People began to believe they had uncovered something universal, a code of life. But what they held in books was a shadow, a compressed version. The steps were gone. The adjustments were gone. Only the end forms remained. The rhythm, the timing, the decisions made in response to conditions, all that was missing. The compression also smoothed imperfection. Numbers required precision. Curves were approximated. Irregular spacing was averaged. The messiness that allowed resilience disappeared in symbols. What looked perfect on paper was less alive than what grew in soil or water. This created a quiet tension. Humans had tools, words, and formulas. They could describe the pattern, they could teach it, they could use it. And yet they had not created it. They had only captured a shadow. Ownership was an illusion. Some argued that compressing nature into mathematics gave them power. They could predict. They could design. They could reproduce. But prediction ignored response. Design ignored adaptation. Reproduction ignored survival. What worked on paper did not always work in reality. Artists felt this. They copied spirals, arranging petals, curves, and shells with perfect ratios. Their work was admired. It followed the formula, but it lacked life. Something subtle was missing, the sequence without sequence, the rhythm without response, the story without time. Farmers tried to use mathematics to plan growth. Rows were calculated, spirals were drawn. Seeds were spaced according to ratios. Crops grew, but not perfectly. Growth adjusted to water, sun, soil. The formula guided, but it did not dictate. The living pattern moved freely, ignoring parts of the plan. The contrast became clear. Symbols promised certainty. Nature promised survival. The two did not always align. Mathematics compressed. Growth responded. Compressed versions were neat. Responsive versions were uneven. Yet both described the same pattern in different ways. Philosophers noticed something more. Naming something gave humans a sense of authority. Assigning ratios, giving letters, calling it a sequence. All of it suggested understanding, mastery. But the real process had no names, no owner. It existed before humans, outside humans, and would continue after. This raised a question that unsettled many. Can something truly be understood if it cannot be controlled? Can it belong to anyone if it existed long before ownership was imagined? Humans could hold the idea, describe it, copy it, but the pattern itself was unclaimed. It did not recognize possession. Even the numbers reflected compromise. Ratios were rounded, fractions simplified, approximations were praised. Precision was impossible in life but easy on paper, and this made the symbols seductive. They promised clarity, they promised mastery, they promised a handle on what could never be held. Despite this, observation did not stop. People returned to forests, fields, rivers, and shorelines. They traced spirals in shells, counted petals, measured angles. The compression made discussion easier. It allowed sharing, it allowed teaching, but observation reminded them of something else. The real pattern was messy, it was alive, and it did not belong to anyone. This tension became central to the way humans approached growth. Symbols were tools, but not masters. Names were convenient, but not real. They compressed what was boundless into something finite, and in doing so, they reminded themselves that life could never be fully captured. The living process continued. Plants bent and branched. Shells turned. Flowers opened. Every movement responded to conditions. Mathematics could describe the form. It could hint at the sequence, but it could not breathe life into it, not predict, not enforce, not understand fully. People started noticing patterns they could not name, sequence they could not measure. The symbols had limits. The living process did not. And slowly they realized that what they called knowledge was only a map. The territory existed regardless of whether it was labeled. The quiet lessons settled in. Humans could compress. They could describe. They could claim. But the pattern itself had no master. It required no approval. It continued quietly, unfolding step by step. Living, responsive, and indifferent to names. Even in compressed form, the sequence had power. It guided understanding, suggested possibilities, and inspired invention. But the compression hid the deeper reality. Sequence was choice over time, adaptation to circumstance, survival in small decisions. That reality could not be flattened into symbols. The final understanding in this stage was subtle. Humans could hold knowledge but not control life. They could admire patterns but not own them. They could compress, simplify, and explain. But the story, the living, moving, unfolding story, belonged to no one. It had existed long before humans, and it would continue long after. This made humans uneasy in a new way. They had tools, they had symbols, they had names. And yet the real sequence, the rhythm, the timing, and the adjustments, all of it remained outside their grasp. They had glimpsed it, but it had not been captured. It had not been contained. And in that unease, a new curiosity grew. If humans could compress the pattern, what else could they only glimpse? How much of life existed beyond labels, outside symbols, beyond any attempt to claim? The answer was invisible, like the sequence itself, present, persistent, and waiting. Humans had begun to feel they understood something. They had named it, measured it, and compressed it into symbols. Spirals and sequences appeared neat on paper, and the rhythm of growth seemed predictable in small places. But nature was bigger than a page, bigger than a garden, bigger than any single observation. As people looked wider, the pattern began to change. It was not wrong. It did not fail. It simply refused to appear everywhere. Small plants, flowers, shells, there it was clear. Branches, seeds, pine cones, still visible. But as the scale increased, as the systems became larger, it faded. The curves bent unpredictably. The spirals twisted differently. Chaos grew. Rivers carved paths across the land. They meandered in ways that no sequence could anticipate. Mountains rose, eroded, and collapsed. Winds shaped dunes in waves that seemed random. The same principle that ordered a flower did not order continents or skies. The sequence had limits. It could not dominate everything. This was unsettling. Humans wanted universality. They wanted rules that applied always. That worked in a shell, a forest, and a galaxy. The pattern refused that. It could survive in small systems where competition and space mattered. But in vast systems, other forces took over. Chaos claimed the stage. The lesson was subtle. Scale mattered. Small systems could follow sequences because the constraints were manageable. Light, space, and energy guided each step. But as systems grew, constraints became impossible to manage. Variability increased. Random events shaped outcomes. The neat sequence became an approximation, not a law. Even in cosmic patterns, some hints remained. Spiral galaxies appeared as if echoing what people had seen in shells. But they were not perfect. Stars did not line up. Distances varied. Gravity pulled and twisted. Chaos dominated the gaps between stars. The sequence was only a faint shadow of what it had been in small systems. This introduced a new way of seeing the pattern. It was not a universal command. It was not a force controlling everything. It was a local solution. It emerged where growth, space, and resources demanded efficiency. Beyond that, it could not impose itself. Beyond that, the world became too vast for order to maintain clarity. Humans had to accept boundaries, not as failure but as a natural limit. The pattern was powerful where it could act, where it could choose, adjust, and respond, where conditions were tight enough to matter. Beyond that, randomness ruled, and randomness was not disorder. It was just a different kind of process, one that the pattern could not control. This idea appeared in forests as well. Small clusters of plants followed spacing and sequence rules. But in large forests, storms knocked branches down. Animals grazed unevenly. Soil varied. Growth adapted, but the clean repetition faded. The pattern survived only in patches, local and imperfect. People began to understand that expectation of universality had been misplaced. They wanted a rule that applied everywhere. The pattern had no ambition. It worked where it could. That was enough. Efficiency mattered locally. Beyond that, chaos shaped outcomes. Rivers also illustrated this. The water followed paths of least resistance. Small streams could twist in spirals, but larger rivers branched unpredictably. Floodplains shifted. Sediment piled up in ways the sequence could not predict. Growth and flow obeyed physics, not human rules. Even in social systems, humans noticed hints of the idea. Communities, cities, and economies often tried to impose order. Streets in grids, buildings aligned. Yet as systems grew, unexpected outcomes appeared. Crowding, congestion, and imbalance disrupted plans. The larger the scale, the more unpredictable the results. The pattern was local, not global. This revealed a truth about observation itself. Seeing the sequence in one place did not guarantee it existed everywhere. What was true in a garden or shell could not simply be assumed for the sky, the ocean, or the mountains. Scale revealed limits. Scale revealed boundary. And boundary was not failure. It was nature's honesty. People felt both frustration and relief. Frustration because universality was denied. Relief because the pattern had survived where it mattered most. Small systems, fragile systems, living systems, they followed the rule when efficiency was critical. That was impressive enough. That was powerful. The lesson reached deeper than observation. Humans began to see that life did not need to be controlled everywhere. Not every system could obey a formula. Not every growth needed precision. Limitation was a part of existence. Chaos was not the enemy. It was a companion, defining the edges of where order could thrive. The sequence also taught patience. It worked best where humans could pay attention to small details, where adjustments mattered, where timing and space influenced survival. As systems became larger, patience alone could not enforce the pattern. Scale introduced new forces beyond the control of counting or compression. This reinforced another understanding. The pattern was not a law imposed from above. It did not dominate all things. It existed only where life made decisions under constraint, and those constraints were local. That was why the same sequence appeared in flowers and shells, but not in mountains or galaxies. Even in organisms, the same principle applied. Small structures followed sequences closely. Cells, veins, petals, branches, they adjusted to maximize efficiency. Larger structures, organs, or ecosystems followed more complex rules. The same simple sequence could not dictate their formation. Life layered complexity over the base pattern. This insight challenged human expectations. People had wanted simplicity and universality. They had wanted a secret code that explained everything. The sequence was a secret code, but only in certain contexts. It revealed limits as much as order. It showed that even nature had boundaries. Accepting that did not diminish the pattern. It made it more mysterious, more remarkable. It survived in pockets, showing power without claiming total control. It adapted to the conditions where it mattered and faded gracefully where it could not. That made it rare and precious, not weak. Humans began to see beauty differently, not as something everywhere, but as something that emerged where conditions allowed. Local systems revealed brilliance. Larger systems revealed scale and unpredictability. Both were essential parts of the story. The limitation also hinted at patience. Life does not impose everywhere. It works where it can. It adapts. It survives. That survival is the real achievement, not universal control, not absolute symmetry, not complete obedience, just persistence within limits, and that became the new perspective. The sequence was powerful, but it was local. It worked where conditions demanded efficiency. It failed where conditions expanded beyond its reach. That failure was not weakness. It was boundary. And the boundary was part of the system, not an imperfection. Humans learned that observation could not claim ownership, even across scales. The pattern existed beyond human measurement, beyond human expectation. It revealed power in small systems, humility in large ones, and the quiet truth that even nature has limits it cannot cross. And in that understanding, the next curiosity appeared. If the pattern could not scale everywhere, what other secrets existed only in small, constrained spaces? What else survived quietly, unseen and unclaimed, in corners of the world where humans could barely watch? The answer waited, as it always did, in the spaces between growth and chaos. Humans had learned to measure. They had named sequences and compressed them into symbols. They had observed growth, noticed efficiency, and accepted imperfection. They even understood the limits of scale. But understanding did not guarantee harmony. When humans tried to expand systems proportionally, they often collided with the logic of growth itself. It was not the Fibonacci sequence directly that resisted them. It was something subtler, a principle of expansion that responded to conditions, not numbers. Growth did not scale evenly. Each step depended on what had come before. Humans tried to impose proportional growth, as if multiplying a formula could create balance. But multiplication ignored context. Farmers planting trees in rows noticed this quickly. A young orchard planted perfectly would look neat for a season. Branches aligned, trunks rose straight. But soon, leaves shaded each other. Roots fought for water. Growth adjusted, twisting, bending, and compensating. What humans had planned was corrected silently by life. The system resisted alignment. Gardeners observed the same thing in flowers. They arranged bulbs in circles, trying to scale the pattern outward. At first, the flowers seemed to cooperate, but as they grew, the spacing changed. Some petals overlapped. Some blossoms leaned toward light differently. Expansion created strain. Growth was proportional only in response to conditions, not numbers. This tension appeared in architecture too. People admired spirals in nature and attempted to replicate them. Stairs, towers, and domes were drawn according to ratios. But when the builders ignored the environment, the proportions failed. Wood twisted, stone cracked. Even small deviations created consequences that multiplied as structures expanded. The lesson became clear. Growth obeyed local conditions first, formulas second. Human systems assumed universality and control. Growth assumed responsiveness and adaptation. The collision was inevitable. Alignment brought consequences. Resistance was built into life itself. Even in small plants, scaling created tension. A vine growing along a wall might start evenly, spiraling upward in neat ratios. But light changed. A branch was damaged. The next spiral responded. The proportional expansion humans had assumed became uneven. Resistance appeared quietly, almost invisibly. But it was there. People began to see proportional systems as fragile. Mathematics promised balance, but balance required more than numbers. It required adjustment, observation, timing, awareness of existing conditions. Without that, proportional growth created stress. In forests, this became dramatic. Trees competing for sunlight would expand outward, seemingly in predictable patterns. Yet gaps, broken branches, fallen neighbors, and uneven soil meant proportional rules could not hold. Expansion without feedback created strain on the trees themselves. They leaned, twisted, and compensated. Resistance was the only way to survive. The same principle appeared in rivers and deltas. Channels widened proportionally, but the water did not obey ratios. Sediment piled unevenly. Floods broke channels. The proportional plan imagined by humans was meaningless without adjustment. Nature enforced its own rules with consequences that humans could not predict. This revealed a subtle truth. Resistance was not opposition. It was feedback. Growth adjusted to conditions. When humans imposed strict alignment, they triggered invisible tension. The system responded. It bent, twisted, and sometimes broke. Alignment created consequences. Resistance ensured survival. Farmers learned it through trial and error. Perfectly spaced crops could fail if soil varied. Irrigation systems could not force proportion. Roots twisted to follow moisture. Plants adapted. The human plan was corrected silently by growth itself. Resistance was built into life. Artists copying spirals and ratios noticed it too. Designs drawn with exact proportions often failed when translated into living arrangements. Petals overlapped. Leaves shadowed others. Small deviations cascaded into larger problems. The formula alone could not account for resistance. This made humans reconsider control. Proportional expansion was seductive. It promised predictability. It promised harmony. But life demanded responsiveness. Alignment without awareness created strain. Resistance was the consequence, not the theory. Even in shells, tiny deviations mattered. Spiral growth followed ratios closely at first, but small environmental changes altered later turns. Expansion created pressure, forcing adjustment. Humans could measure the ratios, but they could not enforce them. Resistance appeared where conditions demanded it. This pattern repeated endlessly. Growth required feedback. Scaling required observation. Numbers alone could not prevent strain. The more humans tried to impose proportional expansion, the more resistance manifested. This insight shifted perception. Humans stopped seeing failure as the only result. They began to see resistance as a signal, a warning that the system was alive. That expansion had consequences. That proportional alignment without attention created tension. The lesson extended beyond plants. Communities, cities, and economies faced similar principles. Scaling human systems without feedback created strain. Streets became crowded, resources became uneven. Expansion ignored the invisible rules of responsiveness, and resistance appeared. Nature did not resist for drama. Resistance was survival. Growth had priorities. Alignment was secondary to existence. Human plans assumed neat proportions, but growth assumed adaptation. The difference was invisible at first, then undeniable. People began to see proportional rules as guides, not commands. Numbers suggested balance, but balance depended on context. Alignment required constant feedback. Otherwise, resistance ensured survival. Even in the smallest systems, the principle held. A branch growing straight might seem obedient, but a slight deviation caused leaves to tilt differently. Roots adjusted underground. Expansion without awareness triggered resistance. Growth responded, quietly but firmly. This made humans reconsider intervention. Control could never fully dominate. Alignment was desirable, but only if it worked with growth, not against it. Resistance was not an error. It was information, a consequence of ignoring local conditions, timing, and feedback. By observing this collision, humans began to respect the limits of proportionality. They saw that scaling required more than numbers. It required patience, observation, and responsiveness. Alignment without understanding created strain. Resistance enforced life's logic. And in that understanding, humans felt a new curiosity. If growth resisted even proportional plans, how many other invisible rules existed? How many consequences went unnoticed because they occurred quietly, corrected by life itself? Resistance was a teacher, showing the cost of ignoring the logic of growth. The story continued quietly. Branches bent, leaves adjusted, roots sought water, expansion happened, alignment was attempted, resistance appeared, and humans watching closely began to notice the dance. Not neat, not perfect, but alive, and alive in a way that numbers alone could never capture. Inside every living body, the pattern people admired in plants and shells appeared differently. It was not neat. It was not perfect. Nothing obeyed exact ratios. Bones did not align perfectly. Muscles did not mirror exactly. Even the organs shifted slightly from one person to another. And yet the body worked, efficiently, relentlessly. The first sign of compromise was spacing. Hands were close to shoulders but not exactly proportional to every bone. Fingers stretched, bent, and curved, responding to use and pressure. Feet varied. Ribs shifted slightly. Each part had room to move, and space was never wasted, yet never perfect. Growth had chosen efficiency, not symmetry. Rhythms emerged in unexpected ways. The heart beat steadily, but each beat responded to signals from the body. Lungs expanded in measured ways, but adapted to movement and energy. Blood vessels curved to reach organs, twisting around obstacles. The pattern was clear, but only if observed as a sequence of responses, not a series of measurements. The body was negotiation. Bones, muscles, nerves, and vessels did not obey a plan. They responded. When growth pressed against resistance, it adjusted. When energy was scarce, movement slowed. When space was tight, curves shifted. Nothing stayed perfectly aligned, and everything survived. People studying anatomy noticed something curious. No two bodies were exactly the same, yet every body functioned. Every body adapted. The differences did not break life. They allowed it. The system was flexible because it could compromise. Even the skeleton reflected this compromise. Vertebrae were similar, but the spine bent differently in each person. Small shifts accommodated muscle tension and movement. Joints followed angles that were functional, not mathematical. The body balanced forces in ways humans could measure only partially. The muscles were a conversation. Fibers pulled, relaxed, and adjusted to load. They overlapped imperfectly. They shared space. They responded to demand. Alignment mattered, but only enough to allow function. Optimization was local, not universal. The body's rhythms extended deeper. Digestion followed timing that varied from day to day. Neural signals adjusted to stress and environment. The body's clock was approximate, responding to conditions instead of following a rigid schedule. Each rhythm was a compromise between need and possibility. Even the smallest scales revealed negotiation. Cells did not divide at perfect distances. Membranes folded irregularly. Energy was directed where it was needed most. The Fibonacci-like sequences seen in plants sometimes appeared in shells or veins, but in the body, approximation ruled. Perfection was impossible and unnecessary. The more people looked, the clearer it became. Compromise was everywhere. No law ruled absolutely. No symmetry commanded obedience. The body balanced priorities, optimized where it mattered, and ignored rules where they were irrelevant. This made the body mysterious. Humans had assumed that nature favored neat ratios, that patterns repeated exactly in every system. The body showed that survival did not need obedience. It needed flexibility. It needed negotiation. It needed compromise. Even the heart reflected this truth. Each contraction was similar but not identical. Blood followed paths that were efficient but not uniform. Arteries branched at angles that responded to growth and space. Optimization was evident, but it was practical, not aesthetic. Bones, too, adapted over time. They responded to stress. They thickened where needed. They shifted slightly to accommodate muscles and movement. Alignment was a suggestion, not a command. The skeleton survived because it could bend within limits, not because it obeyed numbers. This compromise extended to the brain. Neurons formed pathways that were unique in each person. Synapses strengthened where signals were frequent. Connections adapted to learning and environment. No two networks were identical, yet each functioned. The sequence of signals mattered more than perfect spacing. Even organs showed negotiation. The liver shifted slightly to accommodate the stomach. The intestines folded to fit in limited space. The lungs expanded asymmetrically when one side needed more room. Survival was not about symmetry. It was about adjustment. People realized something striking. The body was a story of compromise in motion. Growth and function balanced priorities constantly. Nothing remained fixed. Everything responded to conditions. Life inside the body depended on continuous negotiation. This shifted human understanding. Growth outside the body could be neat and visible in flowers or shells. Growth inside the body was hidden, messy, yet more remarkable. It managed countless decisions simultaneously. Each adjustment was small, but together they created stability. The body also showed that efficiency and flexibility were inseparable. A perfectly rigid system could not survive. A perfectly symmetrical system would fail under stress. Compromise allowed adaptation. Compromise allowed endurance. Compromise allowed life. Even seemingly chaotic aspects like hair growth or skin folds followed subtle patterns. Spacing and density varied according to conditions. Hair tilted to reduce shadowing. Skin folded to allow motion. The body optimized locally with no regard for perfect ratios. Humans observing this began to question their obsession with control. They had tried to force alignment in gardens, buildings, and designs. Inside the body, no force could create uniformity. Yet efficiency was higher than humans had imagined. Nature's logic worked quietly, invisibly, in ways that symbols could never capture. The body also taught humility. Complexity was not something to conquer. It was something to observe and respect. Compromise was evidence of intelligence built into life. Not conscious thought, but practical awareness embedded in growth itself. This inward turn revealed another layer. The same principles guiding branches, petals, and shells applied within. Spacing, sequence, efficiency, and approximation shaped life. But inside it was hidden. Adjustments invisible, corrections silent, consequences immediate. Observation required patience and attention. People began to see the body as a microcosm. Small sequences, local compromises, responses to limits, and adjustment over time created a system capable of survival. External patterns might seem elegant and simple, but internal patterns were dynamic, resilient, and alive. The lesson became clear. Compromise was the secret of endurance. Alignment was temporary. Spacing suggested preference. Rhythms hinted at optimization. Obedience was impossible. The body survived because it negotiated. And in noticing this, humans felt a quiet awe. The Fibonacci sequence, ratios, spirals, and curves were not just external phenomena. The same logic, altered by constraints and negotiation, ran silently inside every living body. Life was a compromise, a story unfolding quietly, step by step, inside the very vessel that carried consciousness to observe it. Survival depended not on perfection, but on flexibility. Not on alignment, but on responsiveness. Not on symmetry, but on compromise. And in that realization, humans understood that the story of growth was as much inward as outward. Humans had spent centuries looking for a secret code, a hidden command behind spirals, petals, and shells. They imagined rules written into the universe, instructions etched invisibly into the world. They searched for formulas, for ratios, for laws that would explain why growth looked the way it did. And yet the more they watched, the more the illusion began to fade. There was no code, not really. Not a command that ordered every leaf, every branch, every spiral. The patterns people admired did not follow instructions. They did not obey a master plan. They did not await a signal from a higher intelligence. Growth was not directed. It was preferred. Preference was subtle. It worked quietly, shaping life without demanding obedience. A petal grew where light was strongest. A leaf tilted where space allowed. A shell spiraled in response to the forces pressing from inside and outside. Every step was a choice, and every choice was constrained by conditions. But there was no instruction, no absolute law telling it what to do. Humans struggled to accept this. They had been trained to look for causality. If X appears, Y must follow. Patterns implied rules. They expected obedience, and the universe seemed polite enough to hint at order. But preference was different. Preference suggested options, adaptation, flexibility, and it denied certainty. Even in familiar examples, the difference was clear. A sunflower did not calculate ratios. It did not follow Fibonacci numbers. It grew where light allowed, where seeds could fit, where nutrients were sufficient. The result resembled the sequence, yes, but the cause was local, responsive, and conditional. The appearance of order was a side effect of preference under constraint. Shells told the same story. A nautilus did not plan its spiral. Its growth responded to pressure, energy, and the curvature of what had already formed. Each turn depended on what had existed before. The sequence was emergent. It was a record of choices, not a pre-written command. Humans observed patterns everywhere and wanted to impose intention onto them. They named the sequence, they counted, they created formulas, but they were mistaking the shadow for the substance. The formulas captured the result, not the process. They compressed the story, but they did not create it. Even flowers within the same species revealed subtle differences. Each plant responded to soil, water, wind, and neighbors. Petals arranged slightly differently. Leaf angles shifted. Yet efficiency persisted. Nature did not follow instructions. It followed preference, adjusting at every step to survive, to occupy space, to capture resources. The realization was unsettling. For centuries, humans had sought rules behind everything. The Fibonacci sequence had been elevated to myth, a key to the universe, a code hidden in life. And yet the truth was simpler and more profound. It was not law, it was behavior, it was choice within limits. This understanding shifted observation from seeking rules to noticing tendencies. Patterns were hints, not edicts. They suggested possibilities, showed what worked repeatedly, but they did not command. Life did not obey mathematics. Mathematics described life partially after the fact. Even in human-designed systems, preference appeared in subtle ways. Buildings adjusted to soil. Roads curved around obstacles. City growth responded to water, terrain, and social patterns. Proportions emerged, but no universal code dictated them. Constraints shaped behavior, not instructions. Nature's indifference became a teacher. Growth did not care if humans noticed. It did not wait for understanding. It simply repeated what worked, avoided what failed, and adjusted to each situation. Preference guided outcomes quietly, without authority, without foresight. Humans noticed consequence, not intent. A seed that fell in sunlight thrived. One in shadow struggled. Patterns emerged and humans mistook them for law. But the real driver was condition, response, and preference. That subtlety made the process mysterious. Order emerged without planning. Rhythm appeared without command. Beauty arose without intention. Even at microscopic scales, preference ruled. Cells divided, moved, and shaped tissues according to local needs. They did not calculate ratios. They did not follow instructions. They responded. They adapted. They repeated processes that had survived, abandoned those that had failed. The pattern that appeared was emergent. Humans began to understand that the myth of a universal code had been convenient but misleading. It promised certainty. It suggested predictability. It implied mastery. But the living process did not require any of that. It required only repeated choices, each responding to conditions, each constrained by limits, each creating outcomes that, when observed, suggested order. This shifted perception of beauty. Order, symmetry, and spirals were not the result of law. They were emergent properties, side effects of countless small decisions, each made in context, each constrained by space, energy, and survival needs. Preference produced beauty quietly, almost invisibly. The body, plants, shells, and entire ecosystems told the same story. Nothing obeyed a universal command. Everything followed preference. Constraints guided outcomes. Adaptation ensured survival. Emergence produced patterns. And humans, watching closely, saw the illusion of law where only choice existed. Even randomness played a role. Small variations, minor disruptions, or unpredictable events influenced the next step. The sequence adapted, bending around obstacles, accommodating change, and continuing. Preference, not instruction, allowed resilience. Life survived not because it followed rules, but because it responded. This realization dissolved the myth. There was no code hidden behind spirals, no secret formula controlling growth, no instruction manual for petals, leaves, or shells. The Fibonacci sequence was visible because preference under constraint repeated often enough to create recognizable outcomes. Humans felt both disappointment and awe. Disappointment because there was no master plan, no secret key. All because life could produce such complexity, beauty, and persistence without any central command. Each pattern was a record of countless small choices, a story unfolding step by step, constrained but free. Observation changed. People no longer asked, "What is the hidden rule?" They asked, "How did this emerge?" They traced sequences of preference, followed adjustments, and noticed tendencies. They saw repetition as a result, not an instruction. Even in large systems where chaos dominated, preference still guided small outcomes. Local choices built coherence in small areas. Patterns emerged where constraints were tight. Where conditions allowed freedom, divergence appeared. The sequence was never universal. It was local, responsive, emergent. Humans learned a new humility. Knowledge was partial. Observation was limited. Control was impossible. Yet patterns persisted. Life did not need laws to survive. Preference, repeated under constraint, was enough. And in that understanding, mystery remained. No code explained the world. No formula commanded it. Patterns emerged quietly, unexpectedly, beautifully. Humans could observe, describe, and wonder. They could approximate the sequence in numbers and symbols. But the story, the choices, the adjustments, the unfolding sequence, remained alive, unseen, and beyond ownership. Preference, not instruction, guided the living world. And in noticing this, humans saw that the mystery was not missing a key. It had never needed one. The secret was simple and profound. Life chooses under limits over and over again, and in doing so, creates the patterns that awe and inspire. Growth does not think. It does not plan. It does not remember what happened yesterday. It does not dream of what might happen tomorrow. Yet patterns appear, spirals form, petals arrange themselves, branches split. Humans see repetition and assume knowledge. They imagine rules and intent. They imagine memory. They imagine design, but none of these exist in the living process. The pattern emerges because conditions repeat. Light falls the same way each day. Water collects in low places. Space fills when empty. Forces act consistently. Growth responds to these conditions step by step, and repetition appears. It is not awareness. It is consequence. Consider a simple plant. A stem grows toward light. The next stem does the same. Leaves spread where gaps exist. Petals form where space allows. Each action follows from the current state. No plan dictates the outcome. No memory remembers past successes, yet the result can appear deliberate. Humans perceive intention where none exists. Even shells follow the same principle. The spiral is not instructed to curve. Each rotation emerges from pressure, chemical balance, and previous growth. A tiny variation affects the next turn. Over time, the spiral forms a recognizable pattern. It is not aware of itself. It does not know what it is creating. It simply grows under repeating conditions. Humans have a hard time accepting this. We want life to have awareness. We assume intelligence behind order. We imagine that beauty requires thought. But growth shows that repetition and pattern do not require awareness. Conditions alone, consistently repeated, are enough. Trees illustrate this clearly. Branches extend where space exists. Roots seek water where soil allows. Leaves tilt toward light. Every split, every adjustment is a response to the current situation. If the sun moves, the branches adjust. If the soil dries, the roots turn elsewhere. The pattern is visible, but the tree does not know it exists. Even in humans, some processes follow this rule. Skin regenerates, bones grow, blood flows. Each process repeats because conditions allow it. Cells divide where they are needed. Signals move where they are strongest. The body functions with rhythm, yet it has no awareness of the pattern it produces. Rivers also follow rules that do not know themselves. Water follows paths of least resistance. Sediment accumulates. Channels curve. Floods shape the land. The result can appear intentional. Meanders look like designs. But the water does not plan. It simply responds to gravity, obstacles, and pressure. Patterns repeat because conditions repeat. This is the quiet lesson humans often miss. Patterns are not proof of intelligence. They are proof of consistency in conditions and response. The living world repeats what works without knowing it. It does not follow instructions. It does not keep memory. It does not intend. Yet order emerges anyway. Even small details reveal the same principle. Petals overlap without a master plan. Leaf veins form branching networks because space and nutrients demand it. Tiny organisms align in predictable ways under pressure or flow. Each action follows the current environment. The repetition is emergent. Awareness is unnecessary. Humans project meaning onto this repetition. They see laws of nature, intelligence, or design, but these are human interpretations. The world itself does not know. It does not care. It simply follows forces and conditions, and patterns appear. This principle extends to evolution. Species adapt because conditions repeat. Traits that survive persist. Traits that fail disappear. There is no awareness, no plan, no memory of what must happen. Survival itself is not intentional. It is consequence repeating under repeated conditions. Even in microscopic life, patterns emerge without knowledge. Cells align in tissues, proteins fold in specific ways, DNA replicates following chemical rules. Each step is reactive, local, and unaware. And yet complexity emerges. Order appears. Humans interpret it as design, but it is consequence. This insight changes how humans see life. Awareness is not required for pattern. Memory is not required for repetition. Intelligence is not required for beauty. Life needs only conditions that repeat and response that follows. That is enough for order to appear. Growth repeats because conditions repeat. That is all. The sun rises, water flows, space exists, nutrients move, time passes, life responds, patterns emerge. No mind directs them. No hand shapes them. No memory stores them. The repetition is emergent. It is not aware. Even in complex systems, the principle holds. Forests grow in cycles. Streams carve valleys. Clouds form. Winds shape dunes. Patterns appear on every scale. Each step follows conditions. Each response accumulates. Humans observe order, but the process itself has no knowledge of order. This understanding dissolves the need for a central intelligence. It replaces intention with consequence. It replaces law with response. It replaces instruction with repeated choice under constraint. The world is consistent but not aware. It is rational but not conscious. Humans are left with wonder. The pattern is visible, mysterious, and often beautiful. But the mystery is not hidden knowledge. It is the quiet result of repetition under conditions. Growth does not know it exists, yet it persists, yet it creates, yet it fascinates. Even the Fibonacci-like sequences, spirals, and curves emerge from this principle. They are not written anywhere. They are not commanded. They are not remembered. They appear because each step reacts to the last under repeating constraints. That is all. This makes the story philosophical without abstraction. Humans can grasp the concept with observation, not speculation. Patterns are consequence. Patterns are emergent. Patterns are unaware. And in that realization, the world becomes both simpler and more mysterious. Simple because rules are unnecessary. Mysterious because no conscious hand guides the outcome. Life's quiet intelligence is hidden in repetition, not thought. It is present in consequence, not planning. It survives because it responds, adapts, and persists. Awareness is irrelevant. Memory is irrelevant. Intent is irrelevant. Only conditions and response matter. The world repeats what works. Each moment influences the next. The past leaves marks only through the present state, not through memory. Patterns emerge, persist, and fade. Humans perceive order. Humans assign meaning. Humans see beauty. The system itself does none of these. And in that realization, humans are humbled. There is no cheat code, no instructions to follow, no consciousness directing growth, only consequence, only repetition, only response. The Fibonacci sequence, spirals, branching veins, shells, petals, everything repeats because conditions repeat, and life responds without knowing it exists. The story continues quietly, step by step. Growth responds to light. Branches bend, roots twist, shells spiral, petals open. Life repeats under conditions, unaware, indifferent, persistent. And humans watch, learning, fascinated, realizing that rules can exist without knowing they exist. The world keeps moving. Growth continues quietly. The Fibonacci-like sequences, spirals, and patterns that humans have studied for centuries still unfold. They do not wait. They do not pause for recognition. They do not care if anyone is watching. Time passes, conditions repeat, and life responds. The sequence continues, not because it must, but because nothing stops it. A flower opens in a field far from human eyes. Each petal grows where light and space allow. The spiral unfolds as it always has. No one observes, no one counts, no one names it. And yet, it is perfect in its own way. The process does not require validation. It does not ask for attention. It simply occurs. In the ocean, a shell grows. Tiny turns curl outward, following forces that humans have tried to capture in formulas. Each rotation responds to the previous. Each layer forms because the environment allows it. The shell does not notice humans, their admiration, or their measurements. The sequence is alive independently. Even forests continue without recognition. Trees grow, branches split, roots twist, and leaves reach for sunlight. Storms bend and break them. Animals graze. Soil shifts. Yet growth continues as it always has. Patterns appear, fade, and reappear. No observer is needed to witness this persistence. Rivers carve valleys with the same quiet logic. Channels twist and turn. Sediment piles and shifts. Floods reshape banks. The meanders are recognizable, yet no one plans them. They exist because water flows and obeys physics, responding to conditions. The sequence of curves continues as it has for millennia. Even in microscopic life, patterns unfold without notice. Cells divide, fold, and align. Membranes form, proteins spiral. Each step is a response to local conditions. No cell knows what it is contributing to. No molecule is aware. And yet, sequences emerge, persist, and repeat. Recognition is unnecessary. Humans observe some of these processes. They trace spirals in shells, measure ratios in flowers, and describe branching in trees. They write formulas, create names, and teach sequences. Yet the world itself does not pause for these observations. Growth continues, indifferent to applause or comprehension. Time stretches. The sequence keeps moving forward. Petals open in the morning, close at night. Leaves follow the sun. Branches adjust to gravity. Water flows downhill. Patterns appear in all scales, from tiny veins to towering trees, from spirals in shells to galaxies far away. Recognition does not guide any of it. Even when conditions change drastically, life finds a way. Seeds germinate after storms. Branches twist around obstacles. Animals move, creating new paths for growth. The sequence persists because adaptation continues. It is resilient, not conscious. It is persistent, not aware. Humans have often sought to impose endings. Stories, explanations, conclusions. They imagine that every pattern should have closure, a final understanding. But the natural sequence has no need for conclusion. It does not pause to summarize itself. It does not reflect. It does not recognize its own existence. It continues quietly, step by step, layer by layer. Even vast systems like oceans and forests operate in this way. Waves rise and fall, leaves emerge and decay, water moves through channels. Each action is local, reactive, emergent. Patterns form because conditions allow them to. They do not exist for recognition. They do not require observation. They simply are. The sequence is not a story with a narrator. It is a process with consequences. Spirals, ratios, branching, repetition. These are results of growth responding to constraints. They appear in countless places simultaneously. They appear whether humans notice them or not. Awareness is irrelevant. Recognition is irrelevant. The process continues regardless. Even human bodies are part of this continuation. Cells divide, tissues repair, veins branch, and organs function. Each adjustment happens quietly. Each response follows the conditions at that moment. Life inside each body continues, independent of observation. Recognition by the outside world is unnecessary. This has a quiet, philosophical weight. Humans like stories that end, explanations that satisfy curiosity, conclusions that feel complete. But the sequence does not provide closure. It does not summarize itself. It does not need validation. Its persistence is enough. Its repetition is enough. Its unfolding is enough. Consider a single seed. It falls into soil unnoticed. It germinates. Roots grow. Stems push upward. Leaves expand. Flowers bloom. Seeds form. Each step is a reaction, a response, a continuation. No observer is present. No instruction guides it. The process persists simply because conditions allow it. Galaxies, too, continue in the same way. Stars rotate, spiral arms curve, dust clouds drift. Gravity and motion guide each movement. The universe does not require recognition. It does not notice humans or their attempts to measure. The spiral is there because physics allows it. The sequence continues without consciousness. Even small disruptions cannot halt it entirely. Storms, fires, droughts, and human interference change local patterns. Some sequences are disrupted, some fail, but in other areas life continues. Growth persists, spirals form, branches split, petals unfold. The story of continuation does not depend on any single observer or event. Humans may feel uneasy with this lack of closure. They search for meaning, for oversight, for awareness. But the natural sequence offers none. There is no self-conscious growth. There is no reflection. There is no judgment. It continues because the world allows it. That is enough. That is life. Even when humans intervene, the sequence adapts. Crops are planted. Roads are built. Cities grow. Systems are designed. Yet growth continues around human structures. Nature responds to conditions. Branches bend over roads. Roots crack sidewalks. Streams find new paths. Recognition is not required. Adaptation continues. The process also teaches a subtle lesson about time. The sequence is not a single event. It is ongoing. Each step is influenced by the previous. Each decision, each adjustment, each response continues the story quietly. Humans witness fragments, but the process itself does not stop. It does not need narrative. It does not need interpretation. It simply continues. Even in abstract patterns, spirals in galaxies or shells, humans see a story. But the story itself is a human construct. Nature does not narrate. It does not need to. It simply unfolds. Branches split. Leaves open. Shells curl. Petals bloom. The process is ongoing, uninterrupted, unobserved, and complete in its continuity. Observation is optional. Understanding is optional. Recognition is irrelevant. The sequence continues anyway. Growth persists because conditions allow it. Spirals, ratios, branching, and repetition emerge naturally. Life repeats steps that have worked before. Patterns form and fade, and then form again, all without awareness. Even in the smallest seed or the largest tree, this principle holds. Nothing stops growth where conditions permit. Nothing requires approval. Nothing demands attention. The sequence is independent of human perception. It unfolds quietly, faithfully, persistently. The natural world demonstrates continuity without recognition. Spirals in flowers, branching in trees, shells curling in the ocean, rivers meandering, veins in leaves. Each is a step in a story that never needs an audience. The sequence continues because life does not wait for notice. It simply persists, quietly, invisibly, endlessly. And humans, watching, measuring, learning, can only witness fragments of the unfolding. They can name the patterns, approximate the ratios, and admire the beauty. But the story does not conclude. There is no final chapter. The process does not pause. It does not reflect. It does not notice observers. It continues because life continues. No formula contains it. No code commands it. No awareness guides it. Growth persists quietly, stubbornly, faithfully. Spirals form, branches split, petals unfold, shells curl. Life repeats choices under conditions, always responding, always adapting. The process is unstoppable. The story is ongoing. And then, without fanfare, the narration ends. Humans stop writing, stop observing, stop counting. The world keeps going. The sequence continues. Not because it must, not because it knows, not because anyone notices. It simply unfolds quietly, endlessly, without recognition, without pause, without end.